Welcome to the JBL Professional Everything Audio podcast, where the conversation is everything audio. This is the place to be if you're a professional musician, mixing engineer, studio owner, installation expert, or venue owner. For over 75 years, top producers, recording studios, and venues around the world rely on JBL every day. Visit us at jblpro.com. Welcome to the JBL Professional Everything Audio podcast. I'm your host, Michelle Ann Owens. My guest today is Rick Kamlet, Senior Manager of Product Management at Harman International. Welcome, Rick.
Thanks for having me.
Great to have you. Today we're talking about commercial speakers and installed audio with JBL Pro. Commercial loudspeakers can be a pretty broad topic, and they fall into a variety of categories. So would you mind, Rick, giving us an overview of these categories to get us started today?
Yeah, we tend to divide our commercial loudspeakers into 6 main categories. There's in-ceiling, on-wall, which are also called surface mount speakers, in-wall, columns, which are the long, narrow column speakers, pendants, which hang down from the ceiling, and then a variety of landscape models. There are some specialty models that don't exactly fit into these 6 categories, but these are the 6 main ones.
Awesome. So based on what you said, there seem to be 2 audiences here. One being the AV Pro, who's responsible for all of the sound, the setup at an event or a venue. And then the layman, maybe an attendee, one of the executives who has potentially taken the sound for granted. It always sounds great. They never really noticed what the actual technical needs are. So let's start with that layman. What are the primary considerations for installing commercial loudspeakers? Or in other words, where do you start?
Well, you start with the general objectives, and I think of the general overall objectives as accomplishing whatever sound quality and character that's right for what's happening in the space. So for applications that include music, you want the music to be pleasant and clear. And for applications with voice, the voice needs to be highly intelligible, in other words, understandable. There are some technical principles that one then needs to follow, but pleasantness and intelligibility are the overall objectives. Now, taking this one step further, there are many factors then to consider about how you accomplish that. You want to think about what sort of activity is happening in the space, and therefore how loud it needs to get, how much bass is going to be required, what form factor of speaker is going to work best with the geometry of the space, how high the ceiling is, and whether the ceiling is a suspended grid, a hard cap ceiling, or an open structure. What's going to fit into the decor, what the budget is for the project, where there are places for installing the speakers themselves, and things like whether the facility needs to meet certain safety regulations or fire regulations. So we make available various application tools that can help with the designing of the system and help it work well. For example, for ceiling speaker systems, we make available for free a program called Distributed System Design that helps the designer figure out which speakers will get to the sound level that's needed, how far to space them apart, if they need loudspeakers for additional bass, then which loudspeaker fits with the speakers they've chosen to pair with, and how many to use, things like that.
Oh, that's interesting. So are speakers and loudspeakers synonymous?
They are. We sometimes try to stick with the term loudspeaker because speaker could be taken to mean the person who's talking, like in a presentation space.
Okay, that makes total sense. So let's dive into the technical aspect a bit for the other audience out there, the AV pros. Now, you said when it's music, it should be pleasant. That's pretty subjective. So how would you define that?
There are many things I think go into the idea of music being pleasant. It's a term that I use because it encompasses, many aspects, of the musical sound character.
Oh yeah, absolutely. And then when you're looking at the geometry of the room, how does a square or rectangular room differ from a room that is not so square or rectangular? Maybe it's irregularly shaped.
Right. Well, the main things that I think are good to look at are how deep the room is and how wide the room is. So, for example, a room that's especially deep may be especially challenging to get sound into the place where the far listeners are located. One that is wide and not very deep, then there are different challenges that one looks at. If it's a high ceiling, it may be difficult to use ceiling speakers at above a certain height because the sound has to travel quite a distance from that high ceiling. That's one of the reasons why there are pendant speakers, for example, in today's open architecture ceilings to space the sound closer to the listeners and make it, again, more pleasant for music and more intelligible for speech. So those kinds of architectural or geometric features.
Mm-hmm. So that makes me think of the distance between the mount and the sound source. Does the sound change the further it travels?
It does. It does. It's clear when it's fairly immediate. As it travels, there's air absorption that absorbs some of the high frequencies and so on. With high ceilings, one of the things that trips you up is the fact that the ceiling speakers often overlap with each other. And the farther away from you they are, the longer the differences are in how long it takes the sound from each speaker to reach your ear. So if you're doing a high ceiling, you want to use a speaker with a very narrow coverage so that the listeners are only listening to the speaker that's above their head rather than listening to every speaker in the room hit their ear at a different time sync, which then makes the music unpleasant and the speech unintelligible.
Oh, yeah, totally. Nobody likes it when the sound is bad or when they can't hear what's going on. That is super frustrating. So we talked about the categories and the placement. Let's talk now about outdoor placement and maybe some unexpected places you might find speakers in those interesting spaces out there.
Well, really anywhere there's sound, there are loudspeakers. Designers try their best to hide the loudspeakers. Architects and facility managers don't want the speakers to be terribly visual or to be a major thing that people see when they go into the space. So if you look around, you often spot speakers in really unexpected places. Designers try to make systems unobtrusive. Outdoor speakers you can find hidden in bushes, in landscape spaces, hidden in soffit recesses and just all sorts of places.
That's awesome. So what's the most creative placement you've ever seen? Like, I think bushes is cool, but I don't know, trash can?
There are places that build them into trash cans. Some of the more unique places include building them into lighting posts, where there are just grills on the sides of the lighting posts. That all you don't realize there's a loudspeaker in there. We just introduced a speaker that probably falls into this category called the GSB. They are garden subwoofers. And it takes a little bit of excavation, but they actually go into the ground. They go underground. And the only thing that sticks up above the ground is the port outlet for the sound and a little cap that goes on that. So it's kind of reminiscent of a mushroom a little bit, but the real business end of the subwoofer is actually buried underground.
I love that. That's so cool. Tell us about some of the newest commercial speakers that were introduced at InfoComm this year.
Yeah, so I just mentioned the GSB. Those are the in-the-ground landscape subwoofers. We also introduced Control 89 MS, which is an above-the-ground landscape subwoofer. So those would go into places where you really don't want to excavate or where it's very close to the water table or whatever, things like that. GSF full range landscape speakers. So we introduced that's two full range models that are aimable, one with a 3-inch and one with a 6-inch. We also introduced SLP speakers, which stands for sleek, low profile speakers that go on the walls. And they're so tight to the wall that they actually meet ADA requirements to go into spaces where that's needed. And then lastly, we introduced Control 68 HP, which stands for high power. It's a high power pendant speaker. We've had Control 60 series speakers in the line for a number of years, and people love the idea of pendant speakers and concentrativity coverage and so on. And this is one that then gets louder than any of the other speakers in that line that we make. So most of these new speakers that we introduced at the InfoComm show have been recognized by Red Dot for their industrial design excellence. So we hope that gives customers confidence, even before the installation takes place, that these speakers will fit into their decor, make a nice, elegant appearance.
Mm-hmm, of course. Yeah, I mean, something that blends in, right? That isn't overly industrial looking or clunky.
Yeah. And it's not unusual to try to make speakers unclunky. There are large installation speakers that JBL Pro is known for that go into things like scoreboards and screens at arenas, and you don't even know they're there.
Right.
You just hear the sound coming out of them.
Right, totally. Now, I want to take a step back for a second. Tell us more about the company, JBL Pro. And then as a follow-up to that, let's talk about what's possible with today's loudspeakers, with all the innovations that you guys have done over the years that wasn't possible, say, 10 years ago.
Yeah, well, JBL Pro has been around for 75 years. The company was started by James B. Lansing, and we are part of Harman International, which is a collection of a number of professional audio brands that include amplifiers and DSP and so on. As of a couple of years ago, we are also part of the Samsung family of companies. And, as far as what's possible today that maybe wasn't 10 years ago, we're finding that, we have to move with the demands of the marketplace. And there are changes in architecture that we have to adjust to. We're making smaller, lower profile, fitting in better all the time with the decor of spaces. There's a movement to column loudspeakers in the industry right now. They're less visually obtrusive. They provide better coverage of particularly a deep space. We were talking about the room geometries. They excite the room reverberation less. They're clearer for speech, even better for high fidelity music. So we make from very small to very large column speakers. The largest are IntelliVox columns, which are used in very large reverb in places like cathedrals and so on. And then another change that's come to mind, which has become much more top of mind over the last 10 years, is more environmental consciousness. So all of our speakers they comply with certifications. RoHS and REACH are two main ones. We're using more recycled materials all the time. We're making our speakers lighter weight. And sometimes that's not thought of as being environmental, but what it does is it requires not such heavy support structures in buildings and so on. And we're making them more energy efficient as far as turning voltage into sound. And we're also putting more energy efficiency into the manufacturing processes.
That's awesome. Yeah, that's all so great, especially with these trends that you're seeing around the environmental consciousness piece. I think that's important for both consumers and professionals in the industry to hear about and to be reminded of, right? So as we wrap up, I would love to get your take on the audio industry at large. I mean, where do you see tech going in the next year?
Well, there are many exciting technologies that unfortunately I can't talk about. Still going through the patent process and so on. But in general, there are always changes in architectural preferences. And when that happens, loudspeakers adapt to the trends in architecture. So, for example, there is a continuing trend toward more open structure or open architecture ceilings. I touched on that already, but we've been seeing it happening more and more in the last decade, retail stores, restaurants, and so on. So we came out with our Control 60 series line of pendant speakers to make them easier to install to the beams that you find in these open structure ceilings, and to get the sound closer to listeners for better sonic quality. So it'll be exciting to see what changes take place. We'll be there to adapt our offerings to meet any new requirements.
Nice. Well, I really appreciate your time and all of your insights today, Rick. Before we close, if listeners have more questions or if they want to find out more, how do they reach out?
The two main websites that I'd recommend, one is the JBL professional website, which is jblpro.com, and the other is the Harman professional website, which is pro.harman.com. And those are the places I'd start. Great.
All right. Well, thank you for joining us, Rick. It was a pleasure chatting with you.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure being here.
And thank you, everyone out there listening, for your time and your interest. If you like this talk, be sure to subscribe so you don't miss the next one. I'm Michelle Ann Owens. Until next time. You've been listening to the JBL Professional Everything Audio podcast, where the conversation is everything audio. Talk to a Harman Professional representative to create the perfect plan for your space. Visit jblpro.com to learn more and to schedule a call with a Harman representative. Thanks for listening.